First of all, it is joint work with two colleagues of mine, Putterman and David Weil from Brown. And they concern kind of tracing some ancestral legacies on individual economic outcomes today in Africa. But before going to the meat of the argument, let me just have you all close your eyes and remember to just like picture two things. If one would take income per capita across countries, in the earliest that we can get data for, this kind of 1960, if you trust the World Pen tables, and fast forward to the latest data on income per capita across countries today, 2014, and you just put them on a graph, you would be amazed to find out, or perhaps not, that they almost line up perfectly along the 45-degree line. There are, of course, outliers, and whenever we talk about development outcomes, we tend to focus on success stories or failure stories, but we forget that basically the average country, it was as poor in 1960, the relative ranking has not changed dramatically. Of course, the globe has become richer, but the relative ranking of countries and the relative ranking of development has not really changed that much. So what does this tell us? It tells us basically that differences in income, differences in prosperity across countries was as a long shadow of history that has already basically formed and influenced quite a bit of our livelihoods today. But then you start thinking harder. You say, 1960 countries? Hold on, in Africa, they didn't even exist at this point in time. So what do we really mean by countries in Africa? And this is our basically beginning of the story. So in some sense, like what I would like think of my project today is kind of think about how history has shaped comparative development within countries today. The old approach would basically say, look, there are stuff that happened in the past, and somehow through some very slow convergence, eventually will be all the same, but it will take lots of time. So think like a very simple-minded economist about convergence models. Others would say, look, you have bad geography, and geography always dooms you to have bad outcomes, and this is kind of basically from time eternal, you always had worse outcomes because of your worse geographic conditions. Now, there is a recent wave of papers in the literature that tries to understand basically better the interaction between historical events and kind of divergence in incomes. And usually what they would think, how to think about how history shapes comparative development, they would say, look, something happens in a given place, an invasion, an empire is formed, or slave traders arrive. These interact with the local environment somehow, and they shape, culture, institutions. You always wave our hands at this point, and subsequent economic outcomes today. And there are papers there talking about the persistence of cultural traits, persistence of institutional legacies, and so on and so forth. Now, but what do we mean about persistence? At which level do we think that this ongoing prosperity of the past basically keeps on having an influence on outcomes today? People would start at the country level, and they would look at basically persistence of economic outcomes at relatively aggregate scale, countries. Then others would go basically within countries, and they would define regions, like the north of the country or the south of the country, or like the administrative regions within a country. And others would look at ethnic homelands, and they would try to look at the evolution of incomes across ethnic homelands over time. What we're doing in this paper, I think that has some value added, is that we're looking at individuals now, at individuals that belong to specific ethnic groups within a village. And we will be asking the question, basically, does your occupational specialization of your great-great-grandparents has a bearing on their contemporary incomes today? Let me pause for a moment and ask the question, but why are you looking at ethnic groups, right? Are they a relevant non-state actor, at least for Africa, where will be the focus of our study? And I guess that's a pie that should suffice for an answer. So this is Afrobarometer surveys in 2008, about 20 countries. Respondents are asked whether they identify more with their nation, Kenya, Ghana, pick your favorite one, or their ethnic group that they belong to. So what you see here, basically, around 50% of the respondents would say that either they identify with their ethnic group as much as with their nation, or actually more with their ethnic group. So that's kind of to give you an idea that ethnic identity is a salient characteristic for understanding basically within, at least within Africa, what an average African would think about ethnicity. Okay, so the key question is, how do descendants of pre-colonially agricultural societies perform compared to descendants of other subsistence cultures? We're going to look at individual level outcomes within villages today in Africa. And when think about villages, actually it's not only villages, it's going to be also about towns. It's going to be also like at urban places in, let's say, the modern sector. Now, why are we looking at this? Why are we looking at whether your pastoral versus agricultural or hunter-gatherer background of our ancestors may have an influence on your economic outcomes today? There is actually a veritable literature in the social sciences that kind of poses an evolutionary framework along which one would like to understand the evolution of mankind from hunting and gathering societies to relatively more modern activities like agriculture, eventually to modernization and urban economies and basically industrialization. In this way of thinking, basically there is a continuum of modernity that starts from basically hunter-gatherer societies, evolves gradually towards more dense agricultural societies, and eventually on the takeoff and industrialization. So if this is true, then one would like to see that indeed tracing at an individual level, tracing ancestry to different occupational specialization of your great ancestors, does this have an impact on your economic outcomes today? So what do we find? We find that indeed individuals tracing their ancestry to groups that pre-colonially they used to do more agriculture than basically other economic activities, they outperform economically other individuals of pastoral background mostly. In our data set it will become evident that the kind of two groups that we can trace back in time are those of more either agricultural ancestry or of pastoral ancestry. They will have very few hunter-gatherers, guys today that trace their ancestry to a hunter-gatherer group in the past. Now, why we care about that? Well, there'll be several reasons. First of all, there is some recent work that I have done with Alberto and Elias where we talk about, we show that ethnic inequality is a very relevant dimension for understanding grievances and, kind of underdevelopment across the world. And so this paper kind of sheds some light on what are the potential origins of differences in income across ethnic groups, at least in Africa. Okay, so why Africa? Well, in some sense, one could have written this paper if we had the data at the global scale of what the ancestors of individuals were doing, a few hundred years ago. We could have basically written exactly the same paper at the global scale. So but these data are not really available. So what is ethnicity in our case? Ethnicity is just like a window that allows us to see the past specialization of the great ancestors of these individuals that today lives in Nairobi, pick your favorite town or village or capital city in Africa. Okay, so Sub-Saharan Africa is going to be our focus. It has an attractive setting in the sense that not long ago, like mid-19th century, the continent would basically be populated by all kinds of different, let's say, lifeways. So you would have pastoralists, you would have hunter-gatherers, and also agriculturalists, either extensive or intensive agriculturalists. And at this point in time, colonization project starts, and one of the things that we get to learn about those groups that populate the African continent is what are they up to? Basically, once this comes from military outposts or missionaries that kind of catalog the types of people and the types of groups that they come in contact with. And so this is now recorded in the Ethnographic Atlas, with all its problems, of course, but it's kind of the only source. So it's the best and the worst source at the same time for the information of what these groups were doing like 100 years ago. And since we know today's ethnic identity of the respondent, at least the self-reported one, we can actually link the guy that says, look, I'm a Kikuyu. We can go to the Ethnographic Atlas and find out what the Kikuyu were doing basically 150 years ago, where they're doing more agriculture or they were more pastoral. And then we can actually link contemporary outcomes at the individual level to the legacy of the specialization of this group, of each group. So let me give you some examples of tribes or groups that are agricultural. These are the Tetela in Congo, for example, the Bisa in Zambia, Other are pastoral groups like the Samburu and the Maasai in Kenya or the Afari in Ethiopia. And you could have, at least in the Ethnographic Atlas, few societies that were specializing in hunting and gathering and fishing. Again, as we will see today, at an individual level, there are very few of these descendants. Okay, so that's the Ethnographic Atlas here. Different colors correspond. Greener places are places where the groups were doing more agriculture. That is, they were getting a larger share of their subsistence from agricultural activities. And the polygons that you see basically mapped are the historical homelands of these groups, again, as ethnographers thought, at least by Murdoch in 1959, that's in the end of his book. So these are pastoral societies, sorry, these are agricultural societies, these are pastoral societies again, and that's a special distribution in space. Okay, so again, what is the argument? The argument is kind of an argument that has been made by Diamond or Bousrap, talking about the evolutionary continuum that you start basically from hunting and gathering, you move into agriculture that basically proves to be a fertile ground for the birth of urban industrial societies. Now, in this case, where pastoralism fits, basically pastoralism is kind of in between hunting and gathering and agriculture, in the sense that although you are having domesticated animals, your lifestyle is more mobile, you get to live in much less densely populated societies, and kind of ethnographers will talk about the work ethic that arises in more dense populated places, and when you have to do repetitive labor that goes along with agriculture, which is less the case for pastoral activities. So they would place basically pastoralism in between in this continuum of progression towards modernity, if you wish. So I'm going to show you basically a very strong pattern, and we feel kind of confident that this pattern is there. We will split the sample in different ways and ask the question, is the pattern coming from a specific country, from a specific occupation, from a specific subset? We're going to find actually that this cuts across many dimensions. This basically ranking of relative prosperity individuals who trace ancestry to agricultural groups today, to agricultural groups in the past, they are actually today doing much better than other individuals. It will be clear that we're getting this pattern when we look at the same exact village, at the same exact enumeration area, at the same exact basically place in Nairobi. So we're not picking there differences in labor conditions, that is basically differences in geographic endowments or other constant characteristics. It's something that people carry with them somehow. So we'll start asking a question, okay, now you establish these differences in incomes across groups, but why? Like, what is driving these differences? And there we will have to wave our hands. I'm going to show you actually what is there in the data, what we can tell, but we cannot basically disentangle clearly what is going on. And there are various theories that one can tell. So, for example, agricultural societies back in the past, they were more likely to get to cooperate with Europeans. We will have some little evidence that actually, indeed, missionaries, whenever they set missions or schools, they would do it more often in agricultural societies rather than pastoral societies. So that would be one potential channel, understanding the divergence in incomes in the last 50 years. Or similarly, given that agriculturalists are more populous than pastoralists in a given country, you could have like a minority being discriminated by the majority. There is some evidence along these lines, and we will show some evidence, but does not seem to be a smoking gun. There is also cultural arguments that have been proposed in the literature to understand why agricultural descent or tracing your ancestry to agricultural groups may actually bear a benefit on your economic outcomes later. So, for example, patience has been shown to be a characteristic, a trace that is more common in agricultural societies. There are some recent papers out there talking about the culture of violence among pastoralists and how basically the fact that you have mobile property and this property can be taken away from you at an instant, you have kind of to cultivate a culture, to cultivate a way of behaving that you basically want to project a guy ready to defend his property. And that will be more often the case for pastoralists rather than agriculturalists. I'm going to show you some, let's say, weak evidence, but suggestive evidence, I would say, that this can be actually going on, and part of the differences in incomes across groups today, across individuals within the same town, within the same village, can be partially traced to these different cultural heritages. But this will come like a bit longer, towards the end of the talk. Okay, so what is the data? The data is the demographic and health surveys. This is actually kind of the most detailed data that we have at the country level. It covers about 32 countries. We only get to use 21 because we need data both on the ethnic identity of the respondent as well as the location of the respondent, so that we can effectively control of where actually these guys currently reside. So there are about 340,000 respondents, and with information on current residents, and we managed to match basically those guys to 280,000 respondents, and this basically map into 187 pre-colonial groups. Okay, so what is the outcomes that we have for these guys? We have their level of education and their level of wealth. So wealth is kind of a composite index that these guys in the demographic and health surveys have put together regarding the assets that they observe in the household, regarding the movable and non-movable property that these guys have. So it cannot be compared across countries, but it is perfectly comparable within a country. This is an example of the countries that we're looking at. So we're missing some important ones, but so that's our sample. Now, that's our contemporary sample, and we have also our historic sample, the Ethnographic Atlas. So at the Ethnographic Atlas level, we have basically information, quite a bit of information about the institutional, societal characteristics of the societies, at least as anthropologists recorded them upon contact with these groups back in the beginning of the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. There are several variables here. We're going to focus on the subsistence type, basically how much of your subsistence comes from agriculture versus herding versus hunting and gathering. I'm going to show you later that there, among the other traits that anthropologists have actually recorded in this dataset regarding whether this community is polygynous or whether there's any class stratification, that is in the degree of inequality, at least that the anthropologists perceived when they were in contact with this community, they don't seem to play much of a role, particularly when you look basically within the same location, within the same village, within the same city and town today. So, about 84% of our individuals, they trace ancestry to basically agricultural groups. That's basically perhaps not surprising. The majority, agricultural groups were more densely populated just because agriculture allows for more calories per square kilometer. About 10%, they are tracing ancestry to pastoral groups, and another kind of 6%, 7%, they come from groups that they were equally split. Their subsistence pattern was equally split between herding and agriculture. It's important here, only 17 individuals out of these 280,000 guys, they actually have an ethnic identity that clearly corresponds to a hunter-gatherer group as of 100 years ago. These are the Mbuti. Okay, so whenever you see in the empirical analysis to follow the effect of being a hunter-gatherer, you should know that this is basically a minor activity vis-a-vis the dominant ones, which is the agriculture versus pastoralism, because actually these 17 guys, they all live in the same exact village. So when I'm looking within village, there is no variation that I can get from these guys, because basically this village drops out of the analysis. Okay, so of course, if you would like to understand the impact of agricultural ancestry on economic outcomes today, and you were to ask this question without observing their people, observing the individuals still residing in their ancestral homelands, and you could get some effect of basically agricultural ancestry being beneficial for your economic outcomes today, it would be kind of hard to know what you're getting. Is it because agricultural homelands are actually also more likely to be urban places, and eventually they get to be much more modern than pastoral areas, which presumably are less conducive to the rise of urban centers? So in order to and of course there can be many other differences between agricultural homelands versus pastoral homelands. So in order to do away with that, we want to focus on the same exact location. So basically, do away with all differences that come from differences in geography, differences in labor markets, differences in kind of transportation available, and just look at exactly the same village or the same enumeration area and basically compare one individual living next to the other. Is your group more dependent on agriculture pre-colonially? Does this basically predict better outcomes today? So essentially, we focus on movers, that is, guys that currently reside outside their traditional homeland, okay? And that's much more common for urban places or places close to the capital cities. Okay, so before telling you exactly how much agriculture impacts your economic outcomes today, let me just show you this table. So this table is actually a bunch of numbers that have some meaning. So the meaning is kind of straightforward. It asks the question, let's focus on basically the first column. The first column is this 16.3 that comes with, on the country fixed effects line, tells you that residing in a given country today explains 16% of the variation in the level of education across individuals. So yes, countries are important. Congo DRC, on average, guys are less educated than Kenya. But of course, ethnicity fixed effects belonging to a specific ethnic group, which is line 3, it actually explains a quarter of the variation in economic outcomes at the individual level. Okay, so just like looking at this would tell you, look, if you really want to find out what drives economic performance across guys, don't look at the country they live in today, but look at the ethnic group they belong to, because this seems to have more explanatory power. So basically, we just kind of open this ethnicity fixed effect and ask the question. Of course, in the ethnicity fixed effect is also the ancestry of is the occupational specialization of your ancestors that might be part of this fixed effect. And that's kind of how our data look like. These are villages. This is Zambia. And so the dots are villages. This is one particular village. Let's kind of zoom in. These are my respondents. Here we have 3 different types of guys. The Bemba, which are predominantly agricultural people, at least in the past. There is one guy that belongs to the Kaonde group. He was like half pastoralism, half agriculture. And the Luba, which were mostly doing pastoral activities in the past. How about the levels of education? Again, if you map the colors to sizes, you will see basically that the guys that are more those that have agricultural background, they are actually more educated than others. So this kind of now aggregated this across basically 10,000 villages or 10,000 towns and enumeration areas in Africa, you will find this systematic pattern. Guys that their ethnic identity reveals that they come from more agriculturally dependent people. Back in the past, they are more educated today, and they are actually having more wealth. How much more educated? About 1 year of education. So a guy from a predominantly pastoral background versus a guy from a predominantly agricultural background, the guy from the latter background, that is the agricultural one, would have 1 year of education more. This is like a substantive effect. Now, is this driven by the fact that, kind of if you're doing agriculture still, of course, and your ancestors were doing agriculture, you're more likely to be better than guys that their fathers and great-grandfathers were only doing pastoral activities? Well, here is a split of the sample by basically, let's look only at non-farming occupations. Still, you would find within non-farming occupations, those of agricultural background doing better. Let's look only at cities and urban places. Still, you would find that in cities today, in Africa, those of pastoral background would underperform economically compared to those of agricultural background. You want to do it by country? We have 20 countries. You can actually ask the question for every country individually. Are guys in Kenya different regarding their background? If you focus only in Kenya, focus only in Nigeria, pick your favorite country, you would find that on average, about 15 countries from my sample, you follow the same kind of pattern. I have little time, so let me actually use this to tell you what we think can be going on. So there are kind of two broad stories that we think are in operation in our data that can partially explain the correlation that we have unearthed in the data. On one hand, you have stories of discrimination. Pastoralists in most countries are actually the minority. Being a minority may not be basically conducive to getting public goods from the government, may be actually make it hard to get, and you may be often victimized by the majority, which could partially explain why we observe this negative relationship between your pastoral ancestry and your economic outcomes today. On the other hand, you have other stories that say that, look, even in a perfect institutional environment, the fact that your ancestors were doing for hundreds of years the same type of activities, they got acclimatized to a given set of beliefs, a given set of values that were best for the type of activity that they were engaged with. For example, farmers, by the very fact that they have to do repetitive labor, they acclimated to more sustained repetitive labor than do herders. They adapt to living in proximity to neighbors because, in a farming homeland, you are more likely to be very close to other guys, where in pastoral homelands, their, density is much less important. So, and at the same time, violence, as I just told you previously, can be one, readiness to project authority over your own movable property, which is basically your cattle, can be basically a trait that is passed from one generation to another. So these are actually traits that you don't, one would like to, so cultural traits are kind of optimal for the stage of development when still these guys are doing pastoral activities versus agricultural activities, but even when they are removed from their homelands, usually, these traits are staying with you because, your parents, and they were indoctrinated by the great-grandparents, and since we're talking about such a little horizon, like 100 years, there is not enough separation that would make this, we think, this cultural channel die. So maybe 100 years from now, redoing the same analysis, you would see no trace of history, but given that we're still relatively close to when these guys left their ancestral homelands, and hence this cultural legacy in the way that you are viewing, or your non-cognitive skills, let's say, may be an important determinant of your outcomes. So I'm talking about these things, but do we have evidence about how these guys are actually reacting, or how they are perceived at least? So in the Afrobarometer, there's a different data set than the demographic and health surveys. Unfortunately, the demographic and health surveys is extremely detailed, but it does not ask any, let's say, interesting question about whether these guys seem more patient or hostile or things like that. There is this other data set, a much smaller one, Afrobarometer, where we kind of, the enumerator in the end of every conversation, of every interview with the respondent, would basically sit down and say, what are your impressions after this interview with the guy? And he would say, look, these guys seem to be a bit hostile, or he was bored throughout the interview, or he was non-cooperative, impatient, suspicious, or dishonest. Here in this basically table, forget about the table, each enumerator would get to talk to 10, 15 basically respondents. Systematically, what we find in the Afrobarometer is that if an interviewer gets to interview a guy whose ancestral legacy, ethnic legacy, is more of a pastoral background, then the interviewer is more likely to say, this guy did not seem very honest. This guy seemed to be a bit hostile. This guy was not really cooperative. Again, this is no bulletproof evidence of something, these are not, of course, randomized controlled trials or anything like that, but these are impressions that really, kind of give some credence to the story of cultural attributes that can be systematically different across groups. Now, in column 1, there is this other question that actually the question is, do you feel that your own ethnic group is discriminated by the central government? Those that have an agricultural background, they are more likely to say, no, we don't feel like that. So in some sense, this table gives evidence for both kinds of stories going on. One of a cultural legacy, and the other of an ongoing political discrimination against groups, against individuals whose groups were more pastoral in the past. Now, you can ask many, many questions in this type of projects, right? For example, is agriculture random? Like, is it the case that maybe some groups in the past were just better than other groups, and they just picked agriculture, which was the modern thing, like 500 years ago. And when industrialization came, they were again the first to move into industrialization. So it's nothing about agriculture per se, but something, some deeper differences between groups. In an attempt to basically go around this, we just say, look, you're more likely to be engaged in agriculture when you happen to live in a homeland that was conducive to agriculture, that it was fertile enough that it would sustain cultivation. If you happen to, your homeland of your group basically was a group that was residing in a homeland that was perfect for herding, well, you would be a herder. So that is, we have an instrument. We are actually have an attempt to an instrument that is exogenous variation in why some groups are more likely to engage in agriculture versus herding, and we can show actually the same pattern. That is, if today individuals living in capital cities, if their ancestral homeland happened to be a fertile place, they are actually much more educated and have higher wealth today. If their ancestral homeland happened to be less fertile and hence less likely to engage in agriculture, these individuals today are worse off. If you were to actually put this paper in a continuation of the previous two that we saw about the Bai group or the Murids, economists usually like to, we lack this depth of understanding for each individual group that is in the data set, but we kind of like to give, a bird's eye view of New York outside. So we know that we miss a lot of action that goes on Fifth Avenue right now or on Third Avenue right now, but we're kind of in the business of saying, look, here's a broad pattern, and here is some suggestive evidence that may explain the broad pattern that comes with. So, I think this is it's a very nice debate here of whether you should zoom in exactly what happened to the Bai group or to the Murids group, or you can actually zoom out a bit and, start talking about more aggregate patterns. Thank you very much.
When you were getting started in the discussion, you had one slide where you had institutions and culture, but then when you were thinking about interpreting your results, institutions sort of disappeared and everything became about culture. Of course, there's a lot of literature about how certain kinds of institutions tend to arise in agricultural-based societies, and you completely neglected that. So let me give you some suggestions and some ideas for how you might be able to get at that. Steve Haber has some interesting work on agriculture as mattering for the development of property rights institutions and for more cooperative political institutions through the mechanism of the creation of storable wealth. Especially this applies to grains, and it especially applies to grains that can be cultivated using rainfall rather than a centralized source of water, which is subject to political capture. And so the point I would suggest is, if you're talking about agriculture that's fruit cultivation, it's not storable. If you're talking about agriculture that's grain cultivation, which is storable, and if it's grain cultivation based on rainfall. So if you use that variation and you find that that is the source of the variation within agriculture, then that points more toward kind of property rights institutions in agriculture than some of these cultural effects. Not that I'm suggesting that these are mutually exclusive. Thank you.
I'm totally with you that institutional stories can play a role. We know that, but I know that in the data, since I'm looking within the same village, within the same basically location in Nairobi, I can say that institutions are kept fixed. They all have the same access to the equally bad or equally good local rights.
It's the past institutions I'm talking.
So I'm getting to that. So the current ones are taken care of because I'm not exploiting variation in this dimension. I kept this environment fixed. In the context of Africa, there is actually very little correlation between state centralization and the rise of agriculture. Why? This has to do more with the environment of Africa. The tsetse fly is kind of the
a fly that does not allow for the rise of kind of domesticated animals that can be usually, so the intensive agriculture is missing from Africa. So when in my sample, or in Africa, when we think about agriculture, is mostly geared towards extensive agriculture with a little bit, few pockets here and there of intensive agriculture. Now, if you run a horse race and say, look, you have a legacy of doing agriculture in tubers and doing agriculture in cereals, you're right. You're going to get basically more. The stronger effect comes from basically tracing ancestry to people whose ancestors were doing more grain-based agriculture than tuber-based agriculture. But also here the numbers are, it just so happens that the larger sample of my agriculturalists in the sample come from grain-based agriculture rather than tuber-based agriculture. And again, it's not surprising, tuber-based agriculture produces less calories per capita or per square kilometer, so the densities would be different across this, different lifeways. But yes, so you can dig deeper a bit into the type of agriculture. So at the first pass, I think we want to make the stronger thing between pastoralists versus agriculturalists.
Thanks, this was fascinating research. So in India too, if I know what a person's ancestors were doing, in 1880, say they were cleaning sewers, I can make a correlation between that and their income now. They probably are Dalits. One could imagine it's some characteristic embodied in them that's being carried forward. One could imagine ongoing discrimination against them. But there's a third mechanism, which is revealed in experiments you probably know about from Carla Hoff, in which she has children perform mazes, randomly calling them up anonymously or calling them up by their name, which reveals their caste. And they do much worse in solving the mazes and take longer to do them, just knowing that the people in the room know what caste they're from, which is the only information that's being communicated by their name. So it's not their competence to do the maze. It's not a situation in which there's actually any discrimination against them because of their caste, but it's something about their expectations of themselves, given what expectations in others they expect to encounter. That is an inherently social interaction that is embodied and expressed in their, you could say, highly stylized economic outcomes in this setting. So I think there are other interesting theoretical pathways you could explore.
Yeah, so this stereotype. Yeah, so this discrimination. So we can call it. There are many different names to call it. I have bad expectations, low expectations of you, maybe, but I'm a good guy, or I'm discriminating against you, and I'm not going to give you the same access to, to the various resources. Yes, so I don't know whether we can get data on that. Again, I think that the broad picture idea here is to tell you that, look, legacy of agricultural past is a significant predictor of outcomes today. This is like a big theme in social sciences, that they talk about this evolutionary framework from basically hunting and gathering societies to more urbanized agricultural societies. Here, I think, is the first paper that shows that this is true at the individual level. Now, why? We're struggling, as we're honest. We have bits and pieces of evidence that are consistent with various theories, but we are open and we will, allow for more as we go forward.
Hello, thanks a lot. Very nice paper, I think. A couple of very brief questions. The first one is about the instrument. Sorry, you didn't have time to develop that very much, but my understanding is that you're using the agricultural, the probability of having high agriculture or fertile land. But in your presentation, you seem to try to get rid of the geographical explanation of the rise in income, or differences in income and differences in education, but you seem to fall back to sort of understood geographical explanation when you use the instrument. The second very brief question is about whether you control for enumerators, especially when you enumerators, particularly when you show us responses in terms of the reaction of interviewees to enumerators. There might be, quite strong biases in terms of ethnicity of enumerators. Thanks.
Yes, we do control for enumerators. Basically, we have enumerator fixed effects. So Bill interviewed 20 people, and then Bill would sit down and write his impression out of each of these guys, and we would basically exploit variation within Bill's answers. So we would not confound Bill with Stelios. Yes, sorry. So the instrument that I'm using, the fertility of land, is of your ancestral homeland. But I'm looking now at you, that you're in New York, and I'm looking at the quality of land in Kentucky. And I know that if Kentucky is relatively, I don't know about Kentucky anything, by the way, but is relatively fertile, then it implies that your background, your ancestors, great-great-grand-ancestors at some point were more likely to be agriculturalists than pastoralists. So I'm still exploiting within New York variation, within Fifth Avenue variation, but I'm getting the legacy of coming from places that they were geographically different, or they are today geographically different.
Good afternoon. I found the talk very informative. And I had some questions about your methodology, your data collection.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to know, for example, when you say pre-colonial, which could be 20th century, how far back did you go? Was there a specific date, target, that every group or every individual needed to go back to, or did it depend on their memory and what they chose to focus on, and so on? I also had a question related to the occupations that were chosen. Was it a matter of, did it start out as strictly agricultural versus pastoral? Were respondents allowed to talk about whatever types of other occupations were involved? If someone, when you talk about individual economic outcomes, and you mentioned that cooperation with Europeans could be a factor with agriculturalists, it's natural to think of something like gold or diamond mining, or slave trade, whether it's continental or Atlantic, and what effect that might have. Mm-hmm. So I would like to hear a bit more about how the questions were set up, the surveys, and so on. Thank you.
So again, these are two different data sets. One is by ethnographers. These are the Ethnographic Atlas, which collects information at the group level, the time period that these ethnographers came in contact with these societies was some time between 1860 and 1910, so that's the window that we're looking at. So it might have been the case that if we were to observe them 300 years earlier, we would have gotten different information, so we don't know. We only have this information as of the eve of the colonial era. And the occupations are today's occupations. So I wish I had a very detailed breakdown of occupations in the past. That is what your great ancestors were used to do. That is your ethnic group. We don't know. We only have very broad categories, mostly pastoral, mostly agricultural, or hunters and gatherers. So that's what I have to rely on. And finally, surprisingly, actually, slavery does not seem to play a big role in the economic outcomes of these individuals today. We do know that it plays a big role in the way that these guys think and trust and things like that, but economically speaking, it doesn't seem to be the case that they're also underperforming economically. Thank you very much.